Hello, team. Welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. This is a Ukraine war, US political, European political, world geopolitical update concerning all the news that's come out today. My goodness, crazy times. And I've been away from the computer for most of the day, but also knowing in the back of my mind, whilst having a very nice time with about 50 people with multiple sclerosis like myself, having a Christmas lunch out, just thinking, my goodness, the world's going crazy and I need to talk about it. So this is the opportunity to do so. Apologies, it's another live, but it gives you the opportunity to discuss what I'm discussing live with me if you so please. Now, where do we start? We're going to start on what would have been a breaking news update earlier, but I didn't have the time to do it. So let's start with that. And that is the headline, a bit of news that you see from the thumbnail, which regards the US wanting to block the EU use of frozen Russian assets. Huge potential loan of sometimes 140 billion euros, sometimes 160, 190, whatever the number is. It's huge, right? And Ukraine desperately needs it. And this is money in Euroclear, predominantly in Europe. It's not the jurisdiction of the Americans, and the Americans are saying, no, we don't want you to use that money to support Ukraine. We, the Americans, want to have access to that money in terms of post-war investments. Absolutely incredible. And when you start putting that together with, say, the new national strategy, defense strategy that's come out, the security strategy, sorry, NSS, that's come out from the United States, and you understand that it is as bad as you can imagine it is, then, you know, Houston, we have a problem. Anyway, yeah, we're going to get into it initially by looking at the Bloomberg article. Sorry, I'm just sorry, I am correcting a typo in the title. We're going to get into this with the Bloomberg article. Let's go to there now. And as you can see, when I get myself in the right place, sorry, a bit chaotic today. As you can see here, the title is "The US urged Europeans to oppose EU plan for loan to support Ukraine." The initial question is, how helpful is this? How helpful is this to Ukraine? You know, does it help or hinder Ukraine? It's more about helping the United States. That's the only entity that I think the Trump administration, and I never quite know whether Trump's actually got anything to do with stuff like this. I doubt it. This is more Vance thinking. This is more Stephen Miller, JD Vance, Heritage Foundation, that kind of group of people, and Trump just goes along with it. He's not a big thinker in terms of geopolitical strategizing, but he would go along with it, and he will be the megaphone through which this is delivered to the world, no doubt. But the article reads, the US lobbied several countries in the European Union in an effort to block EU plans to use frozen Russian central bank assets to back a massive loan to Ukraine, according to European diplomats familiar with the matter. US officials argued to member states that the assets are needed to help secure a peace deal between Kyiv and Moscow and should not be used to prolong the war, said the diplomats, who spoke on the condition of anonymity. So the idea here is, as far as I read this, the money should be used not to prolong the war, which means the money should not be used for Ukraine to prevail. We don't want to help Ukraine prevail here. We want a quick peace, and any money would give Ukraine a greater chance of prevailing. The EU put forward a proposal this week to use immobilized assets to back a 90 billion euro, 105 billion loan to cover Ukraine's economic and military needs for the next 2 years. There are about 210 billion euros of frozen Russian assets on EU soil, and more of those could be used from 2028 on. The US State Department's press office didn't respond to a request for comment. The discussions come at a critical time for Ukraine, with the US pressuring Kyiv to agree a potentially lopsided peace deal with Russia. Ukraine risks running out of money early next year, and President Donald Trump's administration has cut off most US aid, putting the onus on Europe. There's another image that's come out, another graph that's come out using the Kiel Institute tracker that shows that this year the US has basically given nothing, essentially nothing. There's a tiny bit that came before January, before Trump took over. They've given nothing to Ukraine this year. And still, only Trump in the last 24, 48 hours talked about the US being responsible for giving $350 billion of aid, and that's wrong. And it's just, yeah, there's so much going wrong at the moment with, I think, the Trumpian approach to the war. So it is a really lopsided, I think, peace deal as it is at the moment, as we know. And we're going to talk a little bit more on actually what we don't know with regard to the discussions between the Americans and the Russians. Anyway, to continue, Washington has also been eyeing the Russian assets as part of its proposals to enable peace talks with Moscow, and had suggested they could be used to find US-led post-war investments. So just read that bit again. So the US had suggested the assets could be used to fund US-led post-war investments. A US 28-point peace plan has been modified since it first emerged last month, but assets remain one of the key sticking points, along with the status of Ukrainian territories and providing Kyiv with robust security guarantees, some of the people said. So European leaders have been adamant that how to use the assets is a European matter, as the frozen funds are mostly held in Europe. There is, quote, no possibility of leaving the money we mobilized to the US, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz said on Thursday. So the fact that he has to establish that, no, this money can't be used by the US, it's not US money, it's European held money. I mean, that should be obvious, but he's having to say that. Quote, the American government knows this, and this is also the German government's negotiating position, he said. This is also the consensus at the European level. There are absolutely no differences of opinion on this. This money must flow to Ukraine. It must help Ukraine. The EU's plan to use the assets faces domestic opposition as well, particularly from Belgium. We talked a lot about this yesterday, obviously, in the live stream then with Jonathan Fink, and the difficulty that Bart de Wever, the Belgian Prime Minister, is presenting. When most of the funds are held, Merz will travel to Brussels Friday for talks with Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever, that's today, and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, in an effort to break down Belgian resistance to the EU plan. So we're going to come on to that in a little while, because he's done this emergency let's go to Belgium, because my goodness, we've only got a very short time frame for this to be voted on in the EU. And that, I think it's the 18th of December. And if it's not sorted out by then, this money is not going to Ukraine. And Merz was due to go to Norway today for a different trip, and he cancelled that and has gone to Belgium. That's how freaking important Belgium is right now with regard to the war. Merz, who had been a strong advocate of using Russian assets to aid Ukraine, told reporters that he takes the Belgian premier's concerns very seriously, and that he would try to address them at Friday's meeting. Quote, I don't want to persuade him, but rather convince him, he said to a news conference Thursday evening in Berlin after talks with the German regional leaders. Quote, if we take this path, we will do so to help Ukraine, possibly for the next 2 to 3 years. Belgium argues it's yet to receive sufficient guarantees that it won't be left on the hook alone to foot any future bill should Moscow win any future claims on recovering the assets. It also says that using the frozen funds would open Europe and its companies to Russian retaliation. Now, someone was saying yesterday that they can't make this legal claim to those assets. Like, if I don't know the details here, but it's something like if Russia legally challenges the use of those funds for Ukraine, then it opens up Russia to be challenged themselves, and that would open up a whole can of worms. In other words, you know, if Russia wanted to challenge the legality of, at the moment, the kind of freezing of the assets, like already halfway there, right? Russia is unable to access them. If they really wanted to challenge that in court, they would have done so already. They've had 4 years to do that. They haven't done so, and the reason they haven't done so is because it would bite them on the arse more seriously. So it is not worth their time doing that. So, like, potentially one of these defenses from a Belgian point of view, it actually doesn't really hold up. So yeah, Belgium's national budget has received hundreds of millions of euros in tax revenue from the immobilized funds, though it argues that money is being used to provide aid to Ukraine. Belgium's current rejection of the plan remains the main stumbling block to its approval ahead of the EU leaders summit later this month, where the bloc will be aiming to sign off on the proposals. The EU has proposed backing the loan using the bloc's budget or through bilateral guarantees from member states, the assets would remain frozen, and Kiev would only have to pay back the loan if Russia agrees to finance the country's reconstruction and compensate it for the damage the war has inflicted. In addition to Belgium, Hungary is against the plans, and Slovakia said it will not back proposals that provide Ukraine with military support. Approval would only require a qualified majority of member states, so it might not be relevant. The Commission has also floated the option of issuing joint debt in the event that they can't reach an agreement to use the immobilized assets, but member states, including Germany, reject that idea, and the fact that it requires unanimity makes it improbable. Okay, so that's an interesting article, but the headline here is the US wants the frozen Russian assets to be used for the benefit of the US rather than for the benefit of Ukraine. And we are starting to see, well, not starting, we're continuing to see this growing divide between the US and Europe, the US and Ukraine, the US and democracy and freedom. And the Trump administration appears to be wanting to associate itself more and more with nations that eschew that kind of worldview. Now, what we have here is the national security strategy that was released today, and it is incredibly controversial. I did really want to do a whole video on this strategy and look into some of the claims here. I'm just going to look at some of the posts I already talked to you about this morning, but just to give you a greater understanding and context to, you know, the position that the US has with regard to the frozen Russian assets, to the negotiations, to everything. Phillips O'Brien says the Trump administration released the latest national security strategy, and one thing that can be said is that there is no more pretending. It's a plan to weaken European unity, to make Europe MAGA, in other words, to kind of right-wing populist, make Europe right-wing populist, the AFD, National Rally in France, Rassemblement National, Vox, Reform UK, whatever, to force Europe to take economic dictation by the USA and to rehabilitate Russia. So that's how Phillips O'Brien sees it. Here we have the Euromaidan Press saying the new US security strategy includes a clause on, quote, containing NATO expansion and criticism of Europe. So we have the US national security strategy repeating a Russian talking point about no more expansion to NATO. Now, they might want that strategically, but it just does sound rather like a Russian talking point. And especially when you tie it together with criticism of Europe that takes place within the pages. The Trump administration's national security strategy refers to the conflict in Ukraine as the Ukraine war without mentioning Russian aggression. So we've got this situation where throughout the Trump administration, there's been this tendency not to talk about Russia in terms of aggression, not to see Russia as morally culpable for the war at all. And this idea of kind of rewriting history to this extreme and pretty repugnant level. And here we have written into the national security strategy, no mention of Russian aggression really in the context of Ukraine. And this is the Ukraine war. It's absolutely startling. It's interesting as well that it also appears to mention or indicate a desire to pull out from the Indo-Pacific region. So people like Elbridge Colby, who are these big Russia hawks in the Department of Defense, they are probably going to be a little bit annoyed about this. It looks like proper isolationist. It does talk about alliances and relying on Europe, but in a way that is a Europe that looks like very much a white Christian nationalist Europe. Pretty astonishing. Michael Rice says J.D. Vance's intervention in Germany's election on behalf of AfD. So you remember, let's go back, and this all starts making sense when you look back into last year and then through into the Trump administration. When you see the rhetoric that was coming out from people like J.D. Vance, when you saw J.D. Vance go to the Munich Security Summit and slag off Europe and say, actually, you think Russia's your biggest enemy, you're your own biggest enemy. You know, it's Europe, Europe's attack on freedom of speech, that, you know, that's the enemy at the moment. And just absolutely incredible. And of course, what he's doing is PR for the big tech firms. More on that in a second, by the way, because we have Elon Musk and Twitter wading in as well. So JD Vance's intervention in Germany's election, so remember he advocated for the AfD on behalf of the AfD, along with Elon Musk, of course, was not a one-off. It is now ingrained in the US national security strategy. Quote, cultivating resistance to Europe's current trajectory. Europe is to be treated as enemy terrain, to be destabilized by America's enabling of far-right parties, says Michael Weiss, and NATO expansion is bad, as Kirill Dmitriev might put it, doves. So, yeah, here we have quotes, cultivating resistance to Europe's current trajectory within European nations. So this is essentially cultivating resistance. In other words, the United States is going to politically interfere in Europe to make sure that you have what it terms, is it somewhere else? It's not in this part, what it terms patriotic European parties, basically far-right nationalist populist parties, ending the perception, it says, and preventing the reality of NATO as a perpetually expanding alliance. And again, that the way you say that, I mean, you don't really need to talk about that. If you don't want it to expand, just say, okay, we don't really need to mention that. But to really hammer home that it's just perpetually expanding, we don't want that, i.e. we don't like that Sweden just joined, we don't like the Finland just joined. Well, that's only something that freaking Russia would say. It's just absolutely, I find it astonishing. It's egregious, this. Shashank Joshi said that this document, the national security strategy, is a truly sinister document. He said, as the defense correspondent for The Economist, Trump's national security strategy is out and some of the Europe sections are shocking. The growing influence of patriotic European parties indeed gives calls for great optimism. That quote I wanted to bring to mind just then. So yeah, the growing influence of patriotic European parties indeed gives calls for great optimism. The Americans, or the Trump administration, are super happy with AfD, Reform UK, Vox, Confederation in Poland, whoever it is, Rassemblement National in France, because that would cultivate resistance to Europe's current trajectory within European nations. Absolutely incredible. Trump national security strategy, make Europe white again. That's what Joshi thinks. Quote, over the long term, it's more than plausible that within a few decades, certain NATO members will become majority non-European. So they're worrying about the great replacement theory, basically. As it says, the real and more stark prospect of civilizational erasure. You get too many brown-skinned people in there, blah, blah, blah. No, you can have some really decent, robust debate about immigration, but what this appears to me to be is just a set of the most extreme talking points that you see from MAGA types that align very, very well with Russian strategy. As far as I can see, says Joshi, this national security strategy is far harsher on Europe than on Russia. There's no talk about Russia being the bad guys here. Europe are the ones that get a bit of a hiding. There is no mention of a threat from Russia or of deterrence, only that, quote, re-establishing strategic stability is a priority. Europe is cast as a major threat to freedom, a radical, dangerous document. This document seems to indicate that the US has formally pivoted away from Europe and in support of Russia. It is that problematic. And then when you see that they've been trying to get the funding blocked to Ukraine to be given essentially to the Americans, it's crazy. Gustav Gressel, the military analyst, says a regime that is tip to toe corrupted by Arab money. So you've got the American administration, he calls it a regime, that has taken all of this money. You've got, whether it be Jared Kushner himself suddenly having $2 billion in his hedge fund coming from Saudi Arabia, then all that money, and Trump keeps talking about the trillions of inward investment coming from the Middle East, all of this money coming from the UAE and Saudi Arabia, et cetera, et cetera. It's a regime that is tip to toe corrupted by Arab money, but it, as in the US, intends to lecture us in Europe on the defense of Christianity, because essentially this is a kind of Christian nationalism document. This is the most ridiculous foreign policy document I've ever read, and I've read many of those. Absolutely on point there from Gressel. And the last one, and I know I read this to you this morning, but just in case you haven't seen my hits and losses video, this is Chris Owicki that says the new US national security strategy blames undemocratic, quote, undemocratic European governments for failing to make peace with Russia. So the blaming of the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's Europe's fault for not immediately suing for peace. It's absolutely remarkable. It takes a pro-Russian position on NATO, reflects white nationalist views on European demographics, and pledges overt support for far-right parties. While the strategy states that, quote, it is a core interest of the United States to negotiate on an expeditious cessation of hostilities in Ukraine, it says that, quote, the Trump administration finds itself at odds with European officials who hold unrealistic expectations of the war, perched in unstable minority governments, many of which trample on basic principles of democracy to suppress opposition. To translate that, it is saying the countries that support Ukraine are undemocratic countries in Europe that are supported only with minority governments, and they have unrealistic expectations of war. So we want to take all the money that's going to Ukraine. We want to invest it to the benefit of the US, and we don't want to help Ukraine, particularly. We want a quick war, and we don't see Russia at fault at all. There's no talk about Russia being at fault in this document. And Chris Owicki says that was likely a reference to European regulation of social media. And again, we're going to come back to that and think back to what JD Vance said in the Munich Security Conference or Summit, and 2024 annulment of the Romanian election due to Russian interference. The strategy blames European governments for failing to make peace with Russia, but does not mention the strongly pro-Ukrainian sentiment across European populations in virtually every country other than Hungary and Italy. Quote, a large European majority wants peace, yet the desire is not translated into policy, in large measure because those governments' subversion of democratic processes. So it says that actually most Europeans want peace, and by peace it means immediate peace, not really worried about a just outcome to the war, a just peace. We just want peace, and Europeans want a peace, and it's only these undemocratic governments that are acting as obstacles to that peace. But actually the European people, they really want the peace, which is what the US wants, which is what Russia wants. And Trump will say, oh, Putin keeps telling me he really wants peace. This is so divisive. It is freaking divisive. The strategy explicitly praises a rise of far-right patriotic parties allied with US Republicans. Quote, America encourages its political allies in Europe to promote this revival of spirit. Revival of spirit means the spirit of what? 1939 Germany. That we want to revive that kind of spirit. You know, that kind of, what is it? What's on it? It tastes, oh yeah, fascism. That's it. We want that. That's the spirit we want. We want a bit more fascism. Yay, Nazis. So, yeah. America encourages its political allies in Europe to promote this revivalist spirit, and the growing influence of patriotic European parties indeed gives cause for great optimism, because there's nothing like another huge wave of fascism in Europe. There's nothing like it. Woohoo! Slap my thigh. This is exciting. Wow. Brilliant. The influence of white nationalism is also reflected in this paragraph, which alludes to the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. Quote, over the long term, it is more than plausible that within a few decades, at the latest, certain NATO members will become majority non-European, and by that they mean non-white. As such, it is an open question whether they will view their place in the world or their alliance with the United States in the same way as those who signed the NATO Charter. End quote. The strategy places the US on the side of far-right white nationalist forces, saying that it wants, quote, Europe to remain European, to regain its civilizational self-confidence, and to abandon its failed focus on regulatory suffocation. End quote. Among the priorities it lists are, quote, cultivating resistance to Europe's current trajectory with European nations, which strongly suggests over US support assistance for far-right parties such as AfD in Germany, National Rally in France, and Reform UK. Another priority is taken straight from the Kremlin's worldview, ending the perception and preventing the reality of NATO as a perpetually expanding alliance. We talked about that. This is bad news for Ukraine, but also for the Western Balkan countries that have applied for membership. Overall, it's very clear that the strategy reflects JD Vance's views as expressed in his 14th February 2025 speech at the Munich Security Conference, in which he argued that Europe's principal threat is from the erosion of democratic norms rather than Russia or China. And yes, it does also talk about DEI in there, you know, diversity, equity, inclusion, etc., etc. It's incredible. Right. So then we hear today JD Vance saying rumors are swirling that the EU Commission will fine X, so Twitter, hundreds of millions of dollars for not engaging in censorship. The EU should be supporting free speech, not attacking American companies over garbage. So you and I know how much undue, unfair, nefarious foreign influence exists. I was showing someone I sat next to today. She's quite a tech savvy, older lady, bit of a legend in our local MS community, and she was showing me like taking these pictures on her phone and then using Grok to turn them into videos. So you get like a 5-second video from an image. She took a picture of me and then she said, make him yawn, and then she had a picture of her parents back from like 1930 or something, just a black and white picture, and turned it into a video of them laughing with each other. Anyway, she's quite tech savvy. I was saying, well, I was explaining the difference between bots and trolls, and I showed her a picture of some videos of bot farms, of these whole banks of mobile phones that are being dictated to by these single users here and there. And that was just completely distorting people's perceptions of these different political threads that take place. And and I was explaining that now you've got bots that aren't just not just 1,000 different mobile phone or really profiles on those mobile phones saying the same thing and liking the same tweets and reposting the same tweets or whatever, as you dictate it from a single sort of computer. But now you can get them to work with AI, so they are generating kind of fresh content within the confines of their algorithm that you've set in terms of the parameters. You say, right, I want you to go and find all these people that are defending Ukraine, and I want you to go and argue with them using kind of these parameters and so on and so forth. So that's what we're up against. So the European Union knows this and says, right, I presume it's going to be something like, right, Elon Musk, you keep saying that you're for freedom of speech, but you have been skewing your algorithm to favor the far right. And we found that out through research in the US, in Europe, and in the UK, 3 different sets of research. So we know that this is happening. And we also understand that a huge number of the profiles on your platform are not real, like they're either trolls or bots or AI or whatever. You need to do something about that. And he's like, censorship. No, these are literally weapons being used in the information war by Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. Like, you need to freaking do something about that. Anyway, I'm hoping that's what we're talking about here. Anyway, JD Vance says rumors swirling the EU Commission will fine X hundreds of millions of dollars for not engaging in censorship. The EU should be supporting free speech and not attacking American companies over garbage. So what you see from the security conference, what you see from trade deals where the EU and the UK have had the US approach them and say, right, we're going to whack tariffs on you unless you remove regulation of social media platforms, which is your Peter Thiel, your Elon Musk, your David Sachs, with crypto, all of this. Like, we don't want any regulation in these areas because these massive tech oligarchs, these tech billionaires, they are really pulling the strings in the American administration, right? So the only people that can stand up to, the only sizable entities really, like the UK can't do it, Canada can't do it. They had to back down on digital sales tax because the US went in and bullied them. The US kind of bullied the UK. The EU is big enough to be able to stand up to the US, and that's what they're seeking to do. And so JD Vance, you got a national security strategy that could be read as an attack on Europe's desire to regulate social media. Like, honestly, the national security strategy can be seen as a marketing document for Elon Musk and his buddies. So David Kay here says, American reporters, you've got to call bullshit on this, on what Vance is saying. Vance is a purveyor of hate and propaganda. He wants the public to believe rules on, for instance, transparency in advertising and forms of deception on Twitter. That's what we want, right? We want no deception on Twitter. We don't want government-funded deception coming from Russia on Twitter that is disinforming people so that they have a completely distorted understanding of reality and then vote for the wrong people. This is not censorship. This is like warfare in the information spaces. Don't fall for it, says David Kay. Timothy Schneider, historian of the region, says, agreed. And it's not only improper for American elected officials to tell other people around the world what is right and wrong. It goes from improper to humiliating when the American elected official is just doing PR for a company. And it goes from humiliating to malicious when the main produce of the company is oligarchical fascism. Since I'm not an elected official, I will add this. The fine should be hundreds of billions, and it should be used to fund local reporting and computer-free public schools and universities. Wow. So the EU has fined X for deceptive practices, opacity in ads, and researcher access. This promotes user public access to information, which Musk has been preventing, contrary to EU law. The bottom line, Trump Vance want a more powerful, lawless Twitter to protect their and their right-wing allies' disinformation and propaganda. There is a war going on in the world, and it's a war of information and a war of power in the corridors of the White House concerning tech, big tech. The national security strategy basically is an attack on regulation of those that wield inordinate power, as well as anyone supporting Ukraine. And it is not an attack on Russia. Anyway, sorry, I've been a bit ranty because this is freaking serious, right? And this is kind of why I wanted to do a live, because honestly, I'm sort of joining all the dots here, and call me out if you think I'm joining them incorrectly. But to me, this is really, really insidious and an assault on, I think, freedom and democracy and information and truth, and an assault on sovereignty, an assault on European sovereignty, Ukrainian sovereignty, just all of the above. Now, the Kyiv Independent here says the US President Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, takes on a more active role in the latest peace push. Ukrainian officials say they are cautiously optimistic about his involvement. But as I reported the other day, he is optimistic is a grave mistake. Yeah, I wouldn't be optimistic about his involvement. His involvement indicates that they are only interested in business deals. That's what Rory Stewart said the other day on The Rest is Politics, where he said, you know, Jared Kushner was involved in Middle East peace talks. And, you know, I spoke to an ambassador who met with Jared Kushner, and he was like, right, brilliant. Now, fine. Okay, we need to be talking business. And he was far more interested in business deals that would line his own pocket than actual peace in the region. And that is what is going on with Ukraine. There's no reason to think it'd be any different. 2 days after Witkoff and Kushner met Putin, the Treasury Department partially suspended sanctions on Russia announced last October. So there have been these lifting of some sanctions on Lukoil. But anyway, Anne Applebaum here says, okay, Witkoff and Kushner have got back from meeting in Moscow. They were supposed to meet Zelensky in Brussels. That was cancelled because the Russians said you're not allowed to go and meet Zelensky in Brussels. You've got to go straight back to Washington. So Witkoff and Kushner went straight back to Washington. And it turns out that they're not telling the Ukrainians what took place in the Kremlin. I mean, this is supposedly a peace deal for Ukraine. It's about Ukraine without Ukraine. They're not even telling them. So, quote, our task now is to obtain complete information about what has been said in Russia and what other reasons Putin has found to prolong the war and to pressure Ukraine, to pressure us, our independence. That's what Volodymyr Zelensky said last night. In other words, the implication is we ain't been told by the Americans what the frick has happened, what they've talked about. It's our freaking country that they've talked about, but they're not telling us. So then we have the EU Defence Commissioner Andrius Kubilius saying Europe needs its own peace plan for Ukraine. Politico notes that the EU officials fear that even if Trump's new plan does not work, another one will appear in a few months. Kubilius says every 6 months we get new plans, and I feel that we are waiting here to see what plans will come from Washington this year. Plans should also come from Brussels or Berlin. The goal is to find synergistic connections between these two plans and achieve the best result. And of course, the best result for Europe is one that sees Ukraine have a just outcome that restores stability in the region. But that's not what Russia require. The US really cares a damn about. Sorry about that, screaming children just next door. So yeah, today we now hear that the German Chancellor, panicking about the frozen Russian assets that the US has already tried to block, has rushed to Belgium. Now, some people in the US want to gain some economic benefit. This is what he said. This is what Friedrich Merz has said. Some people in the US want to gain some economic benefit. Frozen Russian assets and Jared Kushner and so on and so forth. From a possible settlement of the Russian war against Ukraine. Today, the German Chancellor will hold an unscheduled meeting with the Belgian Prime Minister in the format of a private dinner to discuss the possible use of some of the frozen Russian assets for a reparation loan to Ukraine. Ursula von der Leyen will also be present at this meeting. I mean, this is really serious. So the Euromaidan Press has a piece on this. Merz to the rescue as the EU races to bypass Belgium on Russia's 210 billion euros. Belgium holds 183 billion euros and demands EU-wide risk sharing before releasing a cent. So Merz arrived in Brussels today for emergency talks with Bart de Wever and Ursula von der Leyen over those assets. The trilateral meeting comes 2 weeks before EU leaders vote on a plan to channel the frozen funds into a reparations loan for Ukraine, and amid a growing concern that Washington wants a cut. Quote, this is a European matter, and I see no way in any form of economic benefit to transfer the money we then mobilize to the United States of America, Merz said in Berlin on Thursday. So there's no way in any form of economic benefit they're not going to transfer that money to the US. And of course, that appears to be what the US wants. The comment was a direct response to point 14 of a leaked US-Russia peace plan, which proposed splitting the frozen assets into investment vehicles that would allow both Washington and Moscow to profit commercially. Washington and Moscow, not Ukraine, not the EU. We're going to use that money from the EU, from Russia, to profit Russia and Washington, rather than compensating Ukraine for war damage. Belgium holds a key. So most of the frozen Russian central bank assets, 183 billion euros, sit in Euroclear, a financial clearinghouse in Belgium, in Brussels. Belgians blocked the EU reparations loan plan, with De Wever calling the approach fundamentally wrong and warning that Russian litigation could mean bankruptcy for Belgium. De Wever demanded legally binding guarantees that all EU members are share any financial risk. Absolutely agree with that. So far, only Germany has agreed. Other members have been less forthcoming. Quote, when I bring it up, everyone else just looks at their shoes or the ceiling of the meeting room, De Wever told German broadcaster Tagesschau. And, I agree with De Wever here. Like, he has got definitely some arguments. Merz has publicly backed risk sharing in an op-ed published Wednesday. He wrote, quote, it would be unacceptable for any single country to bear a disproportionate burden. But he framed the stakes in broader terms, quote, if we are serious about this, we cannot leave it to non-European states to decide what happens to the financial resources of an aggressor state that has been lawfully frozen within the jurisdiction of our own rule of law and in our own currency. In other words, sod off US. The European Commission's proposal includes a legal innovation using Article 122 of the EU treaties to prevent any single member states from vetoing sanctions renewal. Under this mechanism, a qualified majority, 15 of 27 members representing 65% of the EU's population, could extend the asset freeze indefinitely. Von der Leyen stated the plan requires only a qualified majority, signaling the Commission could proceed even over Belgium's objection. The EU summit on the 18th to 19th of December will determine whether Europe can unite behind the reparations loan or whether internal divisions hand leverage back to Moscow and Washington. Ukraine's budget runs dry in April. The country needs 135 billion through 2027 to sustain both military operations and basic government functions. And then we hear this. A group of prominent Belgian professors have made a strong case in local media that using immobilized frozen Russian assets to aid Ukraine is legal. I hope Bart de Wever will hear them, says Olena Halushka. So using frozen Russian assets in Belgium to help Ukraine is in accordance with international law, they say. So, there are many arguments going back and forth on this. Okay, we have Macron coming out then. So this is all on the back, remember, of a leaked telephone call, a transcription of this, quite frankly, remarkable conversation between Emmanuel Macron of France, Friedrich Merz of Germany, Alexander Stubb of Finland, and Mark Rutte of NATO. Secretary General. And you had Macron supposedly saying that the US is looking to betray Ukraine. You've got Merz saying they're just playing games with us, as in the Americans are playing games with the Europeans, and that we need to come together and defend, protect Volodymyr Zelensky, or the Ukrainians. He's now had to come out today, Macron, and say unity between Americans and Europeans on the Ukrainian issue is crucial. And I'll repeat again and again, we need to work together, which of course is kind of the bare minimum he's going to have to say. And then we hear this, and it just kind of gets worse, doesn't it? So then we're hearing from Reuters today that the US may partially withdraw from NATO by 2027. Scare quotes, withdraw. Washington demands that Europe take over most of NATO's conventional defense functions, from intelligence to missiles, by 2027. So the headline is exclusive. US sets 2027 deadline for a Europe-led NATO defense, officials say. So we're looking at not just a divorce between the US and the EU, but an extraction of, well, the US essentially drawing themselves away from NATO. There is this very clear isolationist agenda going on. Jakub Janowski from Oryx says complete insanity. Quote, US tells NATO may withdraw from some NATO planning mechanisms if Europe does not take over the majority of NATO's conventional defense capabilities by 2027. In other words, this is a threat. The US has said, if you don't do this, we are going to withdraw from planning mechanisms, and I don't know what that would include, from NATO. So Janowski says the USA better not complain when the EU plus, so that'll be Norway and UK, and maybe Canada even, stop seeing them as allies. They're currently largely considered as an unreliable ally, but still an ally, and stops buying US weapons, ammo, components, etc. in any case, where an alternative will exist. So remember the other day, the Deputy Secretary of State, the guy that sits under Marco Rubio, a guy called Landau, I think he is, said had to go at Europe for not buying enough American weapons with European money. So you've got this incredible, almost bullying position of the US, which is you need to do this. We need to have access to your money, or Russia's money that's your jurisdiction. We need access to that to our benefit, and you need to buy weapons from us. And if you don't take over NATO, we're going to withdraw X, Y, and Z from NATO. I mean, what are we going to wake up to next week? That the US is, that Trump is taking the US to war with Europe. He's like, oh, it turns out that actually I really like vodka as a teetotaler. It turns out I'm really into vodka and a Great Wall of China. The two things that I love the most in the world. So anyway, we've changed sides, and now we're all going to pile in as these great empires and carve up Europe. I mean, I wouldn't put it past him. Shashank Joshi, again from The Economist, says, absurd deadline that reflects either ignorance or pretext to walk away from commitments. US, quote, wants Europe to take over the majority of NATO's conventional defense capabilities, from intel to missiles, by 2027, Pentagon officials told diplomats in D.C. this week. And Shashank Joshi says it's unachievable. You can't magic up intel capabilities like high-end spy satellites in 2 years. It cannot happen. So then you've got this idea that so his claim here is that what the US is demanding of Europe vis-a-vis NATO is actually impossible, and therefore it is a pretext to walk away. So they've said, well, you can't achieve, a bit like expecting the impossible with regard to the peace negotiations. Well, if you can't do that, we're going to walk away. That's one of these theories that's been bandied around, and I've talked about that previously. Well, here is like, well, if you can't get satellites up in space in 2 years to the tune of however many satellites we provide for NATO, then I'm sorry, we're going to walk away. Well, we're never going to be able to do that. Well, then we're going to walk away. Well, then you already know that so you just want to walk away, right? Yeah, we just want to walk away. That really, I mean, if you've not read our national security strategy, we want to walk away. You guys suck. Not really interested in China anymore. We're going to go and make daisy chains back in Oregon. So see ya. Bye. Crazy. Then this is coming from the Daily Express with, caveats applied to that. It's a tabloid newspaper in the UK, a very right-wing tabloid newspaper, but interesting piece this, and it's actually deferring quite a bit to the Wall Street Journal, I think. Trump dealt major blow as Europe threatens a nuclear option if Ukraine deal goes left. So in other words, if the Ukraine deal falls apart and the US become difficult, then there is this claim that Europe could go nuclear. What does it mean? Well, it says the Wall Street Journal reveals a European intelligence agency has distributed internal evaluations regarding, quote, commercial and economic plans the Trump administration has been pursuing with Russia in private discussions. This has allegedly intensified concerns among European officials that the White House is poised to compromise the continent's safety for American economic advantage. Insiders informed the Wall Street Journal that European leaders are weighing severe countermeasures in response, calculated to trigger economic turmoil across the United States. The proposed strategy includes liquidating trillions, not billions, not millions, trillions in American government bonds held by European governments. A swift sell-off could potentially trigger a crash in the value of the US dollar, instigate a liquidity crisis across the banking system, and cause a significant surge in borrowing costs. It could also plunge the American financial sector into a paralysis more severe than the 2008 crisis. A prominent European economist described the plan to the Wall Street Journal as a potential financial backlash that could hit the US harder than any external shock in modern history. The political fallout could be catastrophic for Trump and the Republicans as the midterm elections loom next year. The EU and UK, being among the largest holders of US Treasury securities, US debt, wield considerable potential economic leverage. As of December 2024, the UK holds an estimated $722.7 billion in US debt, and the European Union member countries collectively hold an estimated $1.62 trillion. Combined, this amounts to approximately $2.34 trillion, making the EU-UK bloc one of the single largest foreign holders of US debt. So that could be weaponized potentially to kind of punish the US. Now, I doubt it would get that far, but hey, you never know. Quite incredible. Anyway, so that is, that is that. Oh, goodness me, crazy. So I'd be interested to see what you guys think about that. I'm going to do a few thanks. It's not going to be a crazy long one tonight, but I want to say thanks. I also forgot to say thanks to people last night, and I feel really bad about that. I closed off the live stream I did with Jonathan Fink without saying thanks to Johnny Nedregard, Pete Watson, twice actually. Thank you very much for your support. BME and Kevin Forst. Thank you, as well as Julian Rossiter, as ever. Sigurd Staples, I really appreciate that, from Iceland. Now, if you are here today, Sigurd, great to have an Icelandic supporter on board. I've just watched Katla on Netflix, and Netflix has just put in a bid, I think, or they're saying they're going to take over Warner Brothers today. Now, this in itself is very interesting. So why would Netflix wants to take over Warner Brothers? Well, obviously, to try and it'd be a dangerous, almost monopolistic entertainment entity. But just to add maybe a little bit of a theory as to why that might happen, Paramount Skydance, which is now run by the son of, is it Larry Ellison from Oracle, who's like super right-wing supporter of Donald Trump. They're looking at taking over Warner Brothers themselves. And why that was important is because Warner Brothers owns CNN, Warner Bros. Owns CNN, and they already have CBS, and they put Barry Weiss basically in charge of that. They wanted to skew CBS to the right. Taking CNN would take it from this kind of centrist TV news channel and skew that to the right. And so realistically, what you might have is Netflix, because we know the Netflix CEO is a supporter, for example, of Ukraine. So he's a liberal guy. He's supported, I think, a startup for drones for Ukraine. So Netflix are on Ukraine's side, if you like, or at least the CEO is. and it could be that they want to take over Warner Bros. So that they can actually protect CNN. I don't know if that's just the speculation I came up with today, and I don't know if that is at all what would be happening. I'm sure there's much more to it than that. But anyway, Sigurd Staples, thank you for your support there. And Julian Rossiter, thoughts on why the US is keen on giving Russia back its frozen assets? This is pertinent for today. He asked this yesterday, Julian did. Perhaps certain people in the US administration have vested interest in said assets. Yes. Well, or using that money to further their own agendas. Yeah. It'll be completely to the benefit of, the US as a whole, or particular people in the US. And indeed, that's why they want to open up trade with Russia. They've already had ExxonMobil get involved and have talks. And the roommate of, is it one of JD Vance's mates? No, Donald Trump Jr.'s mates, something like that. One of them connected. It was in the Wall Street Journal article recently, saying this is not peace, it's business. And all these sort of grifters that have been tapping up, Nord Stream 2 pipeline, or this or that, or whatever it is. And they're all out for making a pretty penny or a billion. Thank you to Michael Vujar. Thank you very much for your support, gifting 5 ATP Geopolitics memberships. Thanks, mate. Really appreciate that. Daryl Thomas, hey, mate. JP, I follow loads of sources on YouTube. I'm convinced this has been a plan in this making for 20 years. Witkoff, Trump, and I don't know who that is. Started used Russian money from a Kazakhstan bank. See Rachel Maddow. Now, I know she's quite divisive, but actually she's pretty knowledgeable on Russia and Ukraine and whatnot. Her book Blowout was an exceptionally good book, and it talks about how it talks about the oil industry basically in the US, but then it really is about the connections with Russia through Trump 1.0. And it's just a very, very good book, and she knows her onions there. So I will have to check her out a bit more. I haven't seen much of her recently. I know she dialed back a bunch on MSNBC. She's now MS Now, of course. But I wonder how much is a long-term plan when you see these sort of machinations going on, and the big players like Exxon Mobil, they've got big long-term plans happening, and you wonder what goes on in these dark, smoky rooms for sure. Absolutely. But thank you, Darryl. I really appreciate that. Joe Hales, it's never been in doubt that all the USA wants to do is get as much money as possible from anyone they can to exploit it. Yeah, and I don't want to be too anti-US here. I'm essentially anti-Trumpian isolationism, and I'm for a kind of globalist US. I'm for an internationalist. I'm for alliances, and for us having positive sum gains where we all gain from working with each other. And I just think that the United States at the moment under Trump is really trying to undermine Europe, and is trying to undermine democracy and holding tech companies to account. I mean, all nations are obviously going to want to be prosperous as much as they can. So we have to be careful. That is the driving, essentially the drive of most people and organizations and entities the world over, is to get as much money as possible. And you can look to evolutionary psychology and theories as to amassing resources is something that animals will always want to do. And so there is an element of like, well, yeah, but hopefully we're at a position where we can also start introducing moral behavior as well, and doing things for the benefit of all of humanity. And it seems that the US is stepping away from that. If you look at the national security strategy, it's really interesting. I got I got Copilot to just do a table comparing the national security strategy of Obama, Trump 1.0, Biden, and Trump 2.0, and look at the different focuses on each of them. And both of Trump's one, but even more so this one, is just an absolute move away from anything to do with alliances, anything to do with climate change, and the idea that maybe we would want to work together to mitigate sort of global challenges. And it's all just isolationism and all the stuff we talked about earlier. But certainly alliances are eschewed by by Trump, and that's not surprising. He's super transactional. Like alliance of positive sum gains don't make sense to him. He understands the world as a real estate mogul, which is a zero sum game, which is my gain is your loss, or your loss is my gain. So yeah, Julian Roster, Superman has turned bad. Yeah, that it kind of feels like that, mate. And thank you on both days, Julian. Really appreciate that. Neil's come on. Thank you so much. Gifted 10 ATP Geopolitics memberships. That's so kind. Thank you, mate. And Ola Nielsen, thank you for some Danish love there. Kevin Forst, again, thanks today, mate. I'm sorry, I forgot to thank you yesterday. Just a few more. Thank you, mate. Bad News Badger says, I said back when Ursula and Donald announced the US-EU trade deal agreement that it wasn't a trade agreement, but a divorce settlement. It could well be that you are correct there, Bad News Badger. It would be nice to have good news, Badger. Goose, all right, mate. Super late to the stream, JP, but is there any world where Europe can blow up the US economy without also blowing up the European economy ahead of French, Germany, UK elections? Right. Because I didn't want to dwell too much tonight, and it's Friday night, want to go and see my family and all that. But actually, yeah. So the point about the Ukrainian, the Daily Express article just then is that if they were to go nuclear on the US, it would hurt them. Like any collapse of the US economy is necessarily going to affect the EU. So I just doubt they'd ever do something like that. So therefore, I don't know. I think there's so much. We're so inextricably linked in the world, and this is why this is a really good point in general, Goose, which is like, why should the US be interested in security in Europe? And it's long been, the rationale over the last 70 years has been, well, European security and stability is economic stability and security for Europe, and therefore, because of the inextricable links between the two entities, it is security and stability for the US as well. And they do have an interest in, and that's why they've had soldiers there and NATO operating. It's for the benefit of the US. So the idea is that you need to stand up on your own 2 feet. So I've said this so many times. The US has been in Europe with that many troops and that much resources piled into Europe because they get a benefit from that. Like there's no such thing as a free lunch. They're not like helping out Europe for shits and giggles. They're not helping out Europe because it's the right moral thing to do. It's because they get a return on that investment. And if they go and isolate and pull themselves out, they might think, yeah, now Europe can go and stand on their own 2 feet and we're not spending money over there. Okay, well, you don't get the investment back. You don't get the return on the investment, sorry, which means that you isolate yourself over there and you become less relevant in the rest of the world. And we start being able to operate without you. And that's all fine and well, but don't expect us to jump to dance to your tune. Don't expect you to have leverage over us, because you won't have leverage over us anymore. And we'll do what we want to do rather than doing things in accordance with you and working together as an alliance. It's just, yeah. Anyway, so much to say on that, Goose, but thank you very much. Just a few more. Richard Demi, thank you for your gifted ATP Geopolitics and memberships, mate. Really, really appreciate that. Stephen Bendel, don't doom and gloom. We stood up to Hitler and held our chin. High in the darkest hours, we will stand up against fascism again, both from East and West. A really good point there, Stephen. And actually, I just read was it a French person? Some European talk, and I can't remember the context. I was just looking at one of the socials, and it was a big, long piece on, do you know what? We've got more planes than the Americans as Europe as a whole. We've got more this, we've got more that. We've got industrial capacity. We can't defend Europe in the American way, but we can defend Europe in the European way. And, we can do things ourselves and blah, blah, blah. And it's kind of, there seems to be much more discussion about a divorce, really, that's going on between the US and Europe with regard to military reliance and dependence and strategies and all sorts. But I think, yeah, crazy times, and I think the national security strategy and all of these kind of news pieces coming out, and the Americans' position on Ukraine is more and more galvanizing me to think that I don't think there can be any kind of even vaguely satisfactory outcome to the war in Ukraine with the US having anything to do with it from a diplomatic point of view, unless there's a big, I mean. There are many, many people claiming that the White House is presently in chaos at the moment. There's all sorts going on. Like Pete Hegseth is certainly in a lot of trouble. and that the military is kicking back against the White House, that there is a ruckus taking place and all is not well. You've got a realization from Republicans who see past Donald Trump and 2028, and they understand, you look at all the special elections, you look at Tennessee 7th District, a special election that actually ran. So although it wasn't as big a swing to the Democrats as people are thinking, it was that significant when you understand it ended up not being a special election. It had the turnout of a midterm election. And if you can extrapolate the Tennessee 7 election of Afton Bain, who lost by 8.9% in the end, and it was a Trump 22 plus 22 district. So in other words, it's gone plus 13 to Democrats. If you extrapolate that across the midterms, then you're looking at like a 40 Democrat majority in the House of Representatives. So there's all sorts going on. So then you're starting to get Republicans go, oh, this is worrying. We need to start doing something about this. This ain't good. And of course, it's all going like that because people are reacting against the Donald Trump decisions and the cabinet decisions. And so you are starting to get a lot of people in the Republican Party who want their jobs after November next year starting to, and then you've got Elise Stefanik having a war with Mike Johnson, and there are these internal Republican wars going on, and things are really spicy in the US at the moment, precisely because it's chaotic and all sorts of crazy stuff's going on. Meanwhile, Europe is looking on saying, well, these are the guys that are supposed to be sorting out the peace for Ukraine, and Ukraine's fate is in their hands, but they seem to have joined with the Russians, but actually everyone's having a go at each other, and then they're blowing up stuff in Venezuela and look like they're going to go to war in Venezuela. What the freaking hell is going on? And I'll tell you what, guys, it's keeping me busy. This world is keeping me busy. But you know what? I really wish it wasn't. I really wish we just had Mark Kelly as the Secretary of Defense in the US, someone sensible, and we just, do you know what? This war came to a satisfactory conclusion for Ukraine. But thank you, Stephen. Johnny Nevergard, hey, mate. Good to have you on board, dude. Again, I say a few more. Who's popping? Are we experiencing the same thing our recent ancestors did in the 1930s? Putin and Trump want you to feel afraid. That's a modus operandi of bullies. Could be. I just don't know. There's certainly a growing fascism, but that's in our own backyards as well. And I do worry about that. I do worry about the growth of populism. It is something to contend with. Goose, I watched the stream with you and JF yesterday, and while the Belgian PM was well out of order, isn't the nuclear risk a very real issue? Yes, I agree. I wasn't necessarily advocating for the nuclear option. By nuclear, I mean economic nuclear. How do you hold a nuclear power to account, or do you mean actual nuclear, without it having a friendly and aligned government? How do you hold a nuclear power to account without it having a friendly and aligned government? Yeah. How do you hold Russia to account? Well, you assume that it's not going to release nuclear bombs, and then you sanction the crap out of it and have an economic collapse, and then hopefully that would expedite a regime change from their own people's unhappiness with the decisions that the government is making. I don't know if I'm answering your question. Goose, again, by design, with the UN Permanent Secretary Council member veto, the whole post-World War II implicitly accepts a double standard between the great powers and the rest. Yes, I agree, and I think there needs to be a reform in the UN big time. But it is, to have like Russia have that shouldn't exist anyway. Talaria will tell you about this, and she's got I've interviewed her a couple of times. We've had our arguments, but she has a perfectly valid position and a what's it called? A petition that she is, trying to get momentum for. And I think Russia needs to be voted out of the UN because they weren't validly, they didn't enter it validly. They assumed the role of the Soviet Union, and that was completely, non-kosher. They need to be kicked out, and they need to then reapply, come back into the United Nations, and they certainly shouldn't have a seat on a permanent seat on the Security Council. And there's a massive double standard, but I think it favors the powerful for sure. So it certainly needs reform of some sort. And then finally, thank you everyone. I have issues with him and failed predictions, but Peter Zion was on the Sam Harris Making Sense podcast. Might be worth a listen. I like Peter Zion, but I know that lots of people criticize him for many of his predictions being wrong. But he's great to listen to, and he's always food for thought, and he's a decent guy. Yeah, I like Peter Zion. But yeah, I'll have to listen to that. So thanks for that heads up. If I can find time though, because goodness me, there's seriously not enough time in the day. Okay, look, Betty Pie's been working really hard on trying to get things sorted. So hopefully you've all had like lots and lots of notifications hitting all sorts of different places. So please come and join us on, I don't know, Threads, Instagram, Telegram, Facebook. We're all over the world, except, you know, I'm not there all the time. I struggle even to get into Discord much, but come into Discord as well. Just hang out and discuss things. And no, no, Rob, no, I'm not on OnlyFans. Or am I? So no, I'm not. So okay, and you wouldn't have got notifications for this because literally I decided to do this live 10 minutes before. I've been out all day. I've eaten my fill of a Christmas dinner. I told anecdotes of my prostate experience with my biopsy experience with the Ukrainians, because I sat on a table. Everyone's got MS, apart from one husband of the woman next to me, but everyone else had MS. There were 4 blokes on this table. It's actually, MS is something that affects women more. But there were 5 blokes. 4 of us had prostate cancer. What are the chances? And the one guy at the end, a younger guy, is like, mate, it is contagious. You better get yourself checked. Guy sitting 2 down from me, Gary. Oh, poor man. So he's a bit older than me. Got multiple sclerosis. That's why we're all there. Has 21 tumors in his brain. He's had treatment. It's now down to 16, but he's not long for the world. And he's got prostate cancer. You're like, seriously? Seriously? Come on, universe. Be a bit kinder. Like, MS, prostate cancer, and 21 brain tumors. And he was happy as you like. It was just like, really lovely guy. Anyway, there you go. Just no matter what you have in life, you know, try and have a smile. I guess something like that, something positive. Anyway, so that's why I've not been around much today. That's why I've done a quick live. A live. This is so super important. We are seeing, I think, a fundamental shift with the United States at the moment, and I think it's super worrying. It's super worrying for Ukraine, and that is for sure. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share, and all that kind of stuff. In fact, you know, here's something for you. Look at that, like, subscribe, and that'd be fantastic. And I will speak to you tomorrow. But again, Saturdays as well, you know, are a bit funky for me because I have boys that play football. Though one of the matches cancelled. Weather is minging. Hoping the other match is going to be cancelled. And then a bit of a lie-in. That'd be nice. Take care, everybody. I will speak to you soon. Sorry for this quick end. It's not my usual 45-minute long ending. Slava Ukraini.